Afternoon, everyone who's tuning in. We're just going to wait another moment or so as these numbers climb. And we're not at all surprised to find that fabulous numbers have turned out for a Marta McDowell program. Marta's a big draw for the Emily Dickinson Museum. Hello, everyone. Oh, we're so glad to be here with you. I think we'll go ahead and get started. Welcome, welcome. We're just so thrilled to be with you on this late June day in Amherst, and we are coming to you live from the Emily Dickinson Museum Homestead, where the Poet's Garden is kind of sleepily awaiting the return of visitors when the museum reopens next spring. So yes, the museum does remain closed while we embark on our latest, largest restoration project to date. And when next you return to see us, much of the homestead will be transformed to its period appearance, and we cannot wait to share it with you. Till then, we thank you for continuing to tune in for our virtual programs. My name is Brooke Steinhauser. I'm the program director here at the Emily Dickinson Museum, and I'm here with my colleagues, Elizabeth Bradley, Margaret Draft, Meenakshi Jani, and Melanie Schwimmer. And we're pretty excited because, as Marta and I were just discussing, this is really our first program that we've run sort of together as a team, running it here back, from the homestead in well over a year. So this is an exciting development for us, even in this time that we remain closed. In a moment, I'm going to ask Elizabeth to introduce our esteemed guest, Marta McDowell. But before I do, I just want to mention a couple of things. So since we can either see or hear you today, I'm going to encourage you to participate in a couple of ways. You can use the chat field to tell us maybe where you're tuning in from today. And also, as we move through the program, you can offer up comments about what you're hearing and seeing. So yeah, please chime in and tell us where you're coming from. We love to see that. There's also going to be plenty of time for a Q&A at the end of the program, and Marta would love to answer as many of the questions that you have as we can get to in the time allowed. So feel free to use the Q&A function, which is one of the tools in your toolbar at the bottom of your window. That's where you can place your questions. And then finally, we're using Zoom's automatic transcription service today. And so you may choose to use this feature or to turn it off. If you prefer, you can, again, do that using the toolbar at the bottom of your Zoom window. Our full program should last just about 1 hour. So without further ado, I'd like to invite my colleague Elizabeth Bradley to introduce the wonderful Marta McDowell, who has traveled from New Jersey to be with us today in Dickinson's garden.
Thank you, Brooke. I'm so happy to be here today with you and with Marta and with the rest of our team at the museum, and to be introducing Marta. So Marta McDowell is an award-winning author and a master gardener who has been an incredible friend to the museum and its gardens since the museum's founding. She describes her work as following the relationship between the pen and the trowel, that is, authors and their gardens. And she is the author of The World of Laura Ingalls Wilder, the New York Times best-selling All the President's Gardens, and Beatrix Potter's Gardening Life. Our listeners will appreciate her latest book, Emily Dickinson's Gardening Life, which is a reworked, revised, and full-color edition which explores the plants and places that inspired the iconic poet, and the pictures in that book are just gorgeous. I really advise that you purchase it through Timber Press. From the grounds of the Emily Dickinson Museum, or from the comfort of your own home via a mobile app, you can enjoy a landscape audio tour that Marta scripted. She was also an advisor for the New York Botanical Gardens 2010 show, Emily Dickinson's Gardens, The Poetry of Flowers. She was the 2018 Gardener in Residence at the Emily Dickinson Museum, and she continues to lead volunteer garden days each June. So after this program, there's going to be more to check out from Marta. You'll want to stay tuned for her next book, Unearthing the Secret Garden, about the secret garden and its author, Frances Hodgson Burnett. That's going to be due out September 2021. And she has just embarked on a new book for Timber Press on gardening themes and crime fiction with the working title Gardening Can Be Murder. So we are all really excited for that. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to Marta. Thank you.
Thank you, Brooke and Elizabeth. I want to reassure you all that this is not merely a background picture that you are seeing behind me. This is the actual grounds of the museum. You can see the paths down there. Well, we can barely make out the garden, which is down the hill. There is Austin Dickinson's white oak, which is certainly the prize plant of the entire museum. I'll just turn, you can see the hedge. Oh, you can see the top of a truck. And I think if I turn a tiny bit more, you might be able to get the edge of the house, with the yellow brick house. So here I am in the museum grounds for the first time since 2019. So it's a great joy for me to be here with all of you and share some moments and poetry about Emily Dickinson and her flowers. So we've themed this with the poem Bloom is Result, which is the first poem that you'll hear. We're going to talk all about flowers and restrict ourselves to 7 poems. There are so many. 6 flowers, that may be an underestimate, and assorted insects, which you'll see as well. I just want to take a moment and mention a loss that we have had in the past couple of weeks. We have lost 2 great friends of Emily Dickinson. One is Dr. Judith Farr. Judith Farr was a renowned Dickinson scholar. She was an emeritus professor at Georgetown. She wrote many books and articles, including The Gardens of Emily Dickinson, which is a marvelous book. Also, Ed Wesley, who was a graduate of Amherst College. He loved Emily Dickinson and he absolutely loved nature. I was reading in Ed's obituary that he had grown on, that's not the right word, he had raised 7,000 monarch butterflies in his lifetime to help the monarch population. And he was always teaching young children about nature and butterflies in particular. And with that, we'll move on. Emily Dickinson, here's her Daguerreotype. This is in the special collections at Amherst College. I hope if you haven't had a chance to see it, that you'll stop at Amherst College the next time the Frost Library is open and go down to special collections and see it. You always see this image on the internet, but when you see it in person, it's so vivid and it's small and precious and in this beautiful velvet case. So here we shall begin. Bloom is result. To meet a flower and casually glance would cause one scarcely to suspect the minor circumstance, assisting in the bright affair, so intricately done, then offered as a butterfly to the meridian. To pack the bud, oppose the worm, obtain its right of dew, adjust the heat, elude the wind, escape the prowling bee, great nature not to disappoint, awaiting her that day. To be a flower is profound responsibility. I love that poem because it talks about what a flower has to do to really make it. So we'll start with the peony. You had a little image of the peony on the slide with a poem as well. And we know that there were peonies in the Dickinson garden because, well, she writes about peonies, but also her niece, Martha Dickinson Bianchi, says there were ribbons of peony hedges in Emily Dickinson Face to Face. Actually, I'm very I'm very thankful to Martha Dickinson Bianchi because she spent some time writing down what was in the garden, and that's really helpful to us. The old-fashioned peonies, the ones that you see in most people's gardens, are this Peony Lactoflora. And if you look at the scientific names, they're not always just, like, oh, what is that? It sounds like a, Harry Potter incantation. If you look at Lactoflora, it means a milky flower, right? Like lactose. And it does look like milk, especially the white ones. Emily Dickinson herself wrote in a letter, I counted 3 peonies' noses just out of the ground. That was late one winter day. And if you look at peonies in the late winter and early spring, you will see these little red nubs coming out. And in her letter, she said, they're red as Sammy Matthews. Sammy Matthews was their stable boy. So you can imagine this little boy with a red nose. Martha Dickinson Bianchi also called them commencement peonies. The Dickinsons, as many of you know, were very involved in Amherst College, which they could see from the house. Austin went there. Her father was treasurer. Austin later was treasurer and worked on the campus. And so they always hosted a commencement party. Emily was expected to help serve the guests at the commencement party every year. And so the peonies must have been in bloom at about that time. Now today, the peonies are out of bloom, but I did want to show you what they look like when they're done. So often people cut off the blooms, but this is the seed head as it's forming. So within that big, sort of powder puff of a flower, the female parts turn into these pods. So those are essentially the ovaries that are holding the maturing seeds. So it's something that you can appreciate even if the flower isn't in bloom. So if you have any peonies near you, you can go check them out. All right. Now, what about the ants, right? There are often ants on the buds of peonies. So this is a peony before it's come out. And if you ask a dozen people, I'll bet you that half of them will say, oh, the ants, you have to have the ants on the buds or they won't bloom. That actually is not true. That is, just a tale. But it's a natural fact that ants do like it's the nectar on the peonies. In fact, I found an ant even on this seed pod, they're still hanging around. The nectar is very sweet and the ants come drink at it. So it's just a little thing that happens. This is in my garden. I decided to show you some in my garden as well. The first picture I showed you was actually here at the Dickinson garden. But this is an old-fashioned variety that I got from someone who had them from her great uncle, and it's called Festiva Maxima, and it's got that little red heart. And there it is, further away, along with some single peonies. You don't have to have them big blousy ones, but that's certainly, the big ones were the ones that the Dickinsons would have had. But these smaller petal ones, you don't have to prop up as much. They're great as cut flowers here with a rosebud in the front. And there's another one that I grow that is a new variety. Again, this is not something that would have been available to the Dickinsons in their garden, but this is Mr. Ito, who was a Japanese horticulturist, crossed the old herbaceous peonies with a tree peony, which is woody. It's another Asian peony, and came up with this intersection, so they're called intersectional peonies or Ito peonies. So when you buy them today, if you go to a nursery to buy a peony, you may see these. They are wonderful. They bloom for a long time. They have a lot of blooms. They're lovely colors. You do not have to stake them or put a hoop around them. On the other hand, they're not fragrant. So that is what you've given away in getting some advantages. All right, moving along. We cannot forget the pansy. Emily Dickinson wrote a little poem about heart's ease, and these little pansies show up in various ways in Emily Dickinson's life. I mentioned the poem. Also, they were painted by a family friend, the botanical artist, Ora White Hitchcock. Actually, I'd say she was a scientific illustrator. She did illustrations beyond just botany. Her husband, Edward Hitchcock, was the president of Amherst College. He also taught various science classes there, including geology. And if you go to the Amherst Museum, you can see some of these large-scale paintings that Ora White Hitchcock did for him to illustrate his classes. It was basically the precursor to PowerPoint. So this is her illustration of viola tricolor and a picture of this viola tricolor in my garden, just growing, and they look a little different. So when I came up to the museum this morning, I was really thrilled to see some old-fashioned Johnny jump ups, viola, again, tricolor, looking much more like Ora White Hitchcock's. It's got a sort of toothed leaf and the flower is much smaller. So now I think that the one that I have in my photograph is probably not the actual species, but another little hybrid. And the ones in the museum garden are really more of the originals. So next time I show this picture, I'm going to take a slide of the ones at the museum because I think it's actually more accurate. So you always learn something new when you come here. Now there's Ora White Hitchcock, right? Good Congregationalists. You know, she looks a little stern, but who knows, right? We haven't had a chance to speak with her, and she certainly seemed to love flowers. Again, the Amherst College Special Collections has many of her paintings. Emily Dickinson put that little viola in her herbarium, which is a whole nother talk. You know, the whole looking at the herbarium is such a wonderful thing. And if you've never seen it, you can go on the website for Harvard's Houghton Library. That is where the herbarium is preserved, and they have images of every page, so you can check it out on your own. Now, we're going to have various speakers do these different poems so that you don't always have to hear me. And so now I'd like to introduce Melanie, who's an intern at the Emily Dickinson Museum.
South winds jostle them, bumblebees come, hover, hesitate, shrink, and are gone. Butterflies pause on their passage cashmere. I, softly plucking, present them here.
Thank you, Melanie. And it's a reminder that Dickinson presented flowers to many people in many different ways. So if you read this poem, she's talking about what's happening to a flower. She's not saying any particular flower. And yet that she is, after the winds, the bumblebees, the butterflies, she's plucking them and presenting them in the poem perhaps, but also perhaps in an enclosure of a letter. So that poem went with a letter to Thomas Wentworth Higginson. She was a longtime correspondent with Higginson, and she corresponded with him actually a long time before they ever met face to face. And she took the time to pluck these, they're probably a bigger pansy, but it's related to that Johnny Jump Up, or heartsease as she called them, to pluck them, to gather them in a little bouquet, to press them, and to enclose them in a letter. So I just think that's a wonderful thing. bumblebees come, right? And they do. This is not actually to a pansy, but the bumblebee had come to this lavender plant, and that's also in bloom up here at the museum. Now, Emily Dickinson also sometimes enclosed other things, including, and I have to say, I find this a little bizarre, she once enclosed a fly, I believe no longer alive, in a letter to her cousin, Louise Norcross. And it said in the letter, fly from Emily's window for Lou, who was Louise, botanical name unknown. So again, if you've never had a chance to read Emily Dickinson's letters, be sure you do, because some of them are really very funny and interesting. Now, next, Brooke is going to read this poem.
Would you like summer? Taste of ours. Spices? Buy here. Ill? We have berries for the parching. Weary, furloughs of down, perplexed, estates of violet, trouble ne'er looked on. Captive, we bring reprieve of roses, fainting, flasks of air, even for death, a fairy medicine. But which is it, sir?
I just love that poem. I'm convinced, and I have no evidence of this, that Emily Dickinson was reading The Tempest before she wrote this, and that she was sort of posing as Ariel, who is a sort of fairy spirit in The Tempest, in William Shakespeare's The Tempest. So, would you like summer? Taste of ours? Well, lilacs can be a signal of summer coming. You know, maybe it's a little early, maybe it's spring, maybe it will take until we get to roses. But let's start with lilacs. The lilacs are in bud here in this picture that was taken at the Emily Dickinson Museum. And yet when they come out is really the big joy, because you get that wonderful, wonderful fragrance. And so we're going to do two poems because I just love lilac. So thank you, Brooke. And we're going to turn this one over to Margaret, who is the program assistant here at the museum.
The lilac is an ancient shrub, but ancienter than that, the firmamental lilac upon the hill tonight. The sun subsiding on his course bequeaths this final plant to contemplation, not to touch, the flower of Occident. Of one corolla is the west, the calyx is the earth. The capsules burnished, seeds the stars, the scientist of faith. His research has but just begun above his synthesis, the flora unimpeachable to time's analysis. Eye hath not seen may possibly be current with the blind, but let not revelation by theses be detained.
There's so much in that poem that we could spend the rest of the day on it. But I'm going to concentrate on the botany part of it. So she talks about, of one corolla is the west, right? She's comparing the lilac to the setting sun. So what's the corolla? So the corolla is the flower part, you know, what we call the flower. It's all of the petals put together is the corolla. In other poems, she uses the word sepal, and the sepal is this outside kind of protective covering of the flower. So in general, the corolla and petals That is the colorful part, and the sepal tends to be green. So she says the calyx is the earth. So the corolla, in the case of her poem, right, she's working the metaphor. The corolla is the sun. The calyx is the earth that's kind of holding the sun as it's setting. And there we go. The sepal is same as the calyx. And the capsules burnished, seeds the stars. I hope I didn't put an extra S in there. But the capsules on the lilac, right? They're just, you can see me, they're just forming on the lilac. Again, I'll stop sharing for just a second. And then they're green now. And you can see the little fatter ones are the seeds that are forming. So again, she's saying the seeds of this lilac right there, or in this case, the sun, right? Working the metaphor, are seeding the stars, right? It's really very beautiful when you put the botany and the idea of the, the astronomy together. So again, so much in that poem. She talks about faith and religion and science, but we'll leave it at the botany for now. Again, in the interest of time. So here's another letter that she writes. Again, very whimsical. She writes to Mary Bowles, a friend. How is your garden, Mary? Are the pinks true and the sweet Williams faithful? So here are pinks. They're a little tiny carnation, or dianthus in this case. Again, a very sweet little flower for the edge of a garden. And there is a dianthus, or again, pink, and you can see like a pinking shear, right? A pinking shear is a scissors that cuts things in a zigzag. That's the edge of the flower. That's why we call them pinks. Here's one that Mrs. Hitchcock painted. And there they are in my garden. I realized this morning we're going to have to transplant some of those up here because we don't have any pinks in this garden at the moment. Sweet Williams, that mentioned as well. It's another kind of dianthus. So she was writing to Mary Bowles about two of the same genus, the same kind of category of plants. In another letter, she says to Louise, tell Papa, her father must have been visiting in Boston, tell Papa to come with the Sweet Williams. In other words, tell my father to bring Sweet Williams along with him. And here again, another kind of little dianthus. Actually, I may have the Latin name wrong there. Looks like the same. And there they are in my garden. It's, well, cut as a cut flower. Sweet Williams are a wonderful cut flower. And we know the Dickinsons did bring flowers indoors. So I think that this is probably one that she would have brought inside as well. They last a very long time. It's a biennial, so you kind of have to plant them from year to year. Emily Dickinson learned a lot of this botany at Amherst Academy. She learned it from this book by Mrs. Lincoln, later Mrs. Phelps, Familiar Lectures on Botany. So again, she got a lot of the material that she was using in a class that she took in the equivalent of middle school and high school, and then uses in her poetry when she's in her 20s and 30s and 40s. Lilies, she loved lilies, absolutely adored them. They grew lots of different kinds. Emily Dickinson owned the book Wildflowers Drawn and Colored from Nature, which includes this wonderful plate, another New England botanical artist, Clarissa Munger Badger. There's Clarissa. Tiger lilies. Again, Martha Dickinson Bianchi writes out, they had Madonna lilies and yellow lilies and tiger lilies. And here are tiger lilies in my garden. They're not in bloom up here at the museum yet, but they will be in a couple of weeks. They're all in bud, and they're really very wonderful. You have to be careful you're growing them. Don't wear a white shirt when you're working around them because the pollen on those long stamens will stain your clothing. It's very potent. Emily Dickinson once wrote that the only commandment I ever obeyed was consider the lilies. So I think she often thought that she was a sinner rather than saved. Roses, of course, so many roses. And this one in the picture is blush noisette. It's a little past bloom here, but there's another one I'm going to show you that I'm very excited about. Look at this. This is the Calico Rose. It's called the Calico Rose because of its color. Calico is a fabric print, but also because of its scientific name, because it is Rosagalica with a G and sounds a little like Calico, Gallica. I wish I could do like a scratch and sniff through Zoom because it's incredibly fragrant. They're beautiful petals. When they fall, you can dry rose petals in the microwave, by the way, or, you know, old-fashioned way on a screen in a hot place. But they're very fragrant and the petals retain the fragrance. All right, here we go. Back to our slides. Of course, the roses appear on the wallpaper, which is what you see on the left in her bedroom. That's her original wallpaper. So exciting, a relatively recent find at the museum. And on the right, Mrs. Badger, one of her illustrations from wildflowers drawn and colored from nature. So there are roses everywhere here. And now, Elizabeth, who's the education program manager here, will read our next poem.
Essential oils are wrung, the attar from the rose, be not expressed by suns alone. It is the gift of screws. The general rose decay, but this in lady's drawer makes summer, when lady lie in ceaseless rosemary.
So I picked the poems that I love. I love this poem because it talks about fragrance so much. So the attar from the rose, this is the oil from the rose. And it says, it is the gift of screws, which sounds very odd, but the old-fashioned way of expressing the oil, of getting the oil out of the roses, was this device that had this big screw in it that, you know, you'd like smush them all. She segues in her second stanza into something much darker, because she's not talking about a sachet that you might, you know, make out of rose petals and leave, you know, in the first two lines in a lady's drawer. She's talking about when the lady lie in ceaseless rosemary, which is in a coffin, right? So it's a different, it takes it in a different direction. So it makes it poems. I picked some of these Rosagalica and I wanted to show you the visitor. So this is my setup. It might be a little hard to parse what this picture is, but that's my laptop in the back. I'm sitting at a card table right outside the door of the visitor center. And a bee has been up here nectaring and getting pollen at these cut roses. And that, you know, there are various flowers in this little cup, and it's the roses that this bumblebee was at. So I wanted to share that because it happened just before we started. Now, Meenaksha has volunteered to read this one, another of my favorites. Meenaksha is another intern at the museum this summer.
The grass so little has to do, a sphere of simple green, with only butterflies to brood and bees to entertain, and stir all day to pretty tunes the breezes fetch along, and hold the sunshine in its lap, and bow to everything, and thread the dews all night like pearl, and make itself so fine, a duchess were too common for such a noticing, and even when it died to pass in odors so divine, as lowly spices laid to sleep, or spikenards perishing, and then to dwell in sovereign barns and dream the days away. The grass so little has to do, I wish I were a hay.
Thanks, Meenakshi. there are many days I wish I were a hay as well. So I picked a little bit of grass that had just gone to seed. We don't appreciate grass in the same way that we appreciate flowers, traditional flowers, because grass does have a flower. And so that's why I decided to include this one today, in addition to, again, I love this poem. So here's the homestead on a period map. And I just wanted to point out that the Dickinson meadow was across the street. This is, I think, a little bit later when there's already one house encroaching, but it was a 10-acre meadow, so very extensive. And here's a period photograph looking not down towards the railroad tracks and the, there was a factory that you saw on the map, but this is looking the other direction up to Amherst College to give you a feeling of how close Amherst College was to the homestead. So here's the meadow, and the homestead would be across a street that's in the foreground and looking out. So she had plenty of meadow grasses to be looking at, to be inspired by, and to smell, because this was mowed probably twice a year for hay for the various livestock that the Dickinson owned, horses and things. In the poem, she says, and hold the sunshine in its lap and bow to everything, right? This is a little native grass that was probably in the meadow. This is little blue stem. Look how it catches the sunshine. It equally catches the dew, which she mentions. And there's the inflorescence close up. Again, they're very inviting, and we don't often spend time looking at them. With only butterflies to brood and bees to entertain. So this little brown wood nymph, it's a little skipper butterfly. They're pretty unnoticeable because of their color, but that little blue stem grass is a larval host, meaning this particular butterfly needs that particular grass in order to prosper. So she had that connection. And even when it died to pass, in odors so divine, so it's letting a truck pass. So you imagine the smell of the hay and the hired hands. This is, from another historical photo, but I think of the Dickinsons' hired hands being very similar. We don't know too much about them, but they were out there working when the family was working in other ways, but they were doing the manual labor. And then the grass is cut and it has that wonderful smell, as lowly spices laid to sleep, or spikenards perishing. And this is a picture of the Dickinson barn. It's a little after the Dickinsons lived there because one of the bays of the barn is no longer there. But the hay would have been kept up in the loft. The children used to jump in the hay, they jump in sort of through the loft. And that's spikenard. Spikenard is a native plant. It's Aurelia. So this is the native Aurelia in our part of North America, in Massachusetts, Aurelia racemosa. And I learned from Elizabeth this morning that spikenard, a type of spikenard, was also used by the Egyptians in their burial rituals. So that idea, again, of burial, of that poem having a little twist of the full life cycle is really interesting. This is a letter written by two people that knew Emily Dickinson. So Emily Fowler Ford, a friend from Emily Dickinson's childhood, writing to Mabel Loomis Todd, who was a friend of Emily Dickinson late in life, and also after her death was one of Emily Dickinson's editors. Emily Ford writes, I have so many times seen her in the morning at work in her garden, where everything throve under her hand, and wandering there at eventide, that she is perpetually associated in my mind with flowers, a flower herself. And I'll just close with a final poem and a couple of lovely pictures of butterflies. When diamonds are a legend and diadems a tale, I brooch and earrings for myself do sow and raise for sale. And though I'm scarce accounted, my art, a summer's day, had patrons. Once it was a queen, and once a butterfly. So you can always be rich in the garden. So with that, I would like to open it up to questions. Oh, wait a minute. And I'm going to show you just before we do that, I'm going to show you a couple other things I found in the garden today.
And if I can just interject, Marta, before you do some tell, this is the time. If you have not put a question in the Q&A yet, please do so that we can have a full conversation with Marta in a moment.
So just 3 more little things that I wanted to show you in my bag of tricks. One was, oh, maybe I'll save that for the end. Here. This is all over the Dickinson garden now. It's a lovely pink flower and it's sticky when I'm holding it. This is soapwort. It's W-O-R-T, which sounds really terrible, but I think that's just an Anglo-Saxonism of old garden plants. Soapwort. Soapwort is sticky and I think it will make a sort of suds. But it's a very pretty little flower that will self-sow. Sometimes people call it bouncing bet. Bouncing Bet. I don't know who Bet was, but it sounds like she had a good time. I cut a clematis, as I call them. Some people say clematis, some people say clematis. I say clematis. And the flower part fell off, but I'd show you, I don't know if you can quite see it. It's got this seed pod forming, and one of Dickinson's poems talked about her electric curl, and as these mature they will curl outward and be the seeds. And then finally, and I won't read the whole poem because in the interest of time and wanting to leave time for answering questions, but in the grass here at the homestead I found what Emily Dickinson called the elf of plants. I mean, doesn't that just look like an elf? It's such a great color. It's absolutely yellow. So with that, we have a few additions I see here. Thank you, Elizabeth. Elizabeth says, rosemary for remembrance. Let's bring in a little Ophelia after Ariel. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed. And also that Wart, W-O-R-T, was a name often given to beneficial and healing plants. So after this program, I'll have some homework. I need to look up soapwort and find out, well, what was it used for exactly? It's one of those plants, you know, again, probably brought over along with people who work settlers here.
So Marta, we've got a couple questions coming in, and I think while people are still adding theirs, I thought we could just take a moment, and I love that you start your book out this way, but for those who are here today and maybe haven't read your book yet, can you tell us how you came to Emily Dickinson and how she came to be a source of inspiration for you in your garden and in your writing?
Absolutely. I had a 20-year corporate career after getting an American Studies degree, which I loved, but was not perhaps the most employment friendly. I decided, you know, I needed to work for a while and make some money. So I did certainly study Dickinson. She never spoke to me until one day I was on a business trip. I was driving across Massachusetts. I stopped because I had an opening on my schedule. And so I pulled into one of the rest areas on the Mass Pike, and there were brochures, and I saw the Emily Dickinson Homestead, as it was called at the time. And I called up, and I remember this, it was on a payphone. So that's how long ago it was. And said, can I make it up to a tour? And she said, yes, drive straight north on 91 and blah, blah, blah. And you'll get into the last tour, which I did. And I discovered that day that Emily Dickinson and I shared something in common. And that was we both loved to garden, because when I wasn't working, I was always gardening. And it changed my life. So, you know, museums can really change your life. And Emily Dickinson was the first subject I ever had for an article, you know, and I just was absolutely smitten with Emily Dickinson and have been ever since. So thanks for asking. You're muted, Brooke.
Thank you. Yeah, great. So thank you for sharing. I love that story too. And thank goodness you saw that brochure, you know, and found that payphone. That was the start of something pretty great for the museum as well. I have some great questions rolling in. So I like this one from Louise, who is wondering how many of the plants shown might be descendants of what was on the grounds in Emily's time.
It's an absolutely great question. My guess is that probably two, the lilacs and the peonies. They tend to be very long-lived. We know that a family who lived here after the Dickinsons, so the last surviving Dickinson of the immediate family and their offspring was Martha Dickinson Bianchi. I keep mentioning her. She was the last of Austin and Susan Dickinson's children to be alive. And so she sold the homestead to another family called Parke, P-A-R-K-E. The Parkes did extensive changes, and yet they would have just transplanted. This is my assumption. I don't have any documentation for this, but lilacs, you would move them. You wouldn't, especially at the time, you wouldn't have ripped them out and started from scratch. People would have moved them. Same with peonies. They live forever. You know, I've got peonies that people have given me decades ago, and they look exactly the same, only bigger. So other than that, there are trees, certainly the oak tree that I mentioned at the start that you can see over here. That would be an original, and many of the trees are offspring of things that we know that Austin Dickinson planted. Pretty much everything else, I'm going to say, is probably put in since then. It's possible that some of the seed has popped up, you know, kind of from the soil, because the garden is still roughly where it was in the Dickinson's time. We know from where the stone walk is and from archaeology work that was done that the stone walk is pretty much where it always was. And we know that the garden was always down this slope that faces sort of east and southish.
Thank you. I think there might be some, if I'm remembering correctly, plants that Susan Dickinson, Martha's mother, and Emily Dickinson's sister-in-law may have put in that might be making appearances north of the path, Marta. This is a part of the yet been restored, and so I think we have sometimes seen, I'm thinking of daffodils, Marta.
You're absolutely right, and thanks for the reminder. So there are plans to do a restoration of the path between the houses. So for those of you who haven't been here, the homestead is where I'm sitting, but next door, one house closer to town is the Evergreens, which is where Austin and Susan lived. And there was a path connecting the two houses that was not the sidewalk. It was inside the fence and hedge. That path is being restored, I think, over the next year, if I have the timing right. You correct me if I'm wrong. And we've been monitoring where these old daffodils pop up in the woods, because it's where Susan had one of her garden patches.
I love that as we are listening to you, we're also hearing this go by, which is would not have been may not have happened without the work of the poet's father, Edward, in the 1850s, helped to bring the train to town, and it still runs on those very tracks today. Let's see, we've got some great other questions too. Who says, when I visited the Dickinson house, I remember I read she cultivated wildflowers. Could you speak about that?
So that's a very interesting topic, because we don't know for sure how many of the wildflowers that are in the herbarium that she actually cultivated. We know that she collected a lot of them, and some of them are in the garden. Things like, oh, there's a little, it's called Dutchman's breeches. It's a kind of dicentra, which is the same as bleeding heart, if that means anything to anyone. It's a small little flower with this very cute little heart-shaped white blossom, and it looks a little like bloomers, so they call them Dutchman's breeches. That's all over the garden. It is also in the woods. So you go, well, did Emily Dickinson, in addition to picking a flower and putting it in her herbarium, did she also dig up a few, which now is a no-no, but then was done a lot, and plant some in the garden? That same thing is true of bloodroot. There are other things around. We're not sure. It's a good question. All we can say for absolute certainty is she was familiar with the plants in the herbarium, not necessarily that she cultivated them.
And this question follows right on. Deborah would like to know, was Dickinson's accuracy and knowledge as a botanist, was that unusual for her time? Could she have had other women classmates of equal skill?
Deborah, it's fascinating, but botany was actually considered a very appropriate subject matter for 19th century women. That it was, I think, a way to talk about sex without talking about sex, right? It was like, oh, we can talk about pistils and stamens, and we don't have to talk about, vaginas and penises. So I think it was something that got women out of doors. It was considered socially appropriate to paint, to collect, to grow. And so I think many of Emily Dickinson's classmates would have been equally proficient. The herbarium is labeled with the scientific name. Beyond that, Emily Dickinson really drops the use of scientific names. She doesn't use the botanical name, she uses common names. So I think she was always interested in plants, but it would be a stretch to say that she was a scientist. I think she was interested and quite proficient in horticulture as a gardener.
I do love that description that her cousin that Emily Fowler sends to Mabel Lewis Todd of seeing her in the garden as a flower and describing her proficiency in that space. Let's see, Shannon, and I see that a couple of people had questions about the greenhouse, the conservatory that Elizabeth has answered in the chat that the museum did restore that space that was taken down after the Dickinsons no longer lived in this house. But we did restore it just in 2017. And so since then, Marta and others have had a chance to be in that space, to see that space, to even sometimes do a little work in that space. Shannon would love to know, what's it like to work in that historic conservatory?
So it is wonderful because for years, what we would do would be in the summer, we'd arrange plants outdoors in the space in the kind of ghost of the conservatory. The conservatory was removed in 1917 by this same family, the Parks, who bought the house, bought it fair and square. Emily Dickinson was certainly known at the time. She probably wasn't the kind of celebrity that she is now. And so, I imagine the conservatory was falling off, so they took it down. They did save a lot of the parts, though. We love them for that. They saved windows and the old doors and things in the garage that they built. So, 100 years later, after lots of meticulous research, archaeology, et cetera, and fundraising put back together, and now you can step through her father's study, which is exactly what Emily Dickinson did. And you can step into this space that was her little garden off the dining room. She calls it that because it's up against the dining room windows. So it's small. And if you wanted to keep it heated to go, so it wouldn't freeze, you'd open the windows of the dining room and crank up the stove in there, and that would heat this little glass room. So it's got a lovely set of shelves that one of the carpenters at Amherst College built. It has these beautiful pots that are hand thrown by a Connecticut potter named Guy Wolf, and he makes these beautiful reproduction pots. It's got one pot that they discovered in the basement of the Evergreens down in the cellar, and plants. In the winter, in the summer, we may even take the cactus out. It gets super hot in the summer. So this would also have been true of the Dickinsons. They did not use that as a summer garden. The garden in the summer was outdoors. It was a winter garden. So from frost to frost, you'd have your plants inside. So it's great to be in there. It adds such a feeling to the interpretation of the house, because that was a place like the garden where we know Dickinson worked. And someday I hope that the kitchen is restored, because Emily Dickinson was also a baker. For those of you who like to have your hands in a different kind of flour, we could do that as a program. That's really, that will be a great addition to how we think about Emily Dickinson.
Thank you, Marta. And our time is drawing to a close. There have been a few other great questions. Someone was curious about the flowering white tree behind you, Marta, which I believe is Acoustic Dogwood.
Yes, which probably was not here when the Dickinsons were here. Various people have planted various things, and then it's a little hard to cut them down when they're so pretty, but it probably is like not really period appropriate. But don't tell them I said that, because I don't want to be the one who gets tagged with Marta said to take down the Acoustic Dogwood.
Yeah, well, it's here now, and it'll probably be here when you all come back to the meeting. I think we could maybe end with one final question, and a couple of you were interested in sort of future plans at the museum for restoration of this wonderful cultural landscape that we have. And we do have wonderful plans for restoration, and there is a lot of work to do. And Marta has been a really wonderful contributor to some of these plans for interpretation and restoration. I would like to ask you, Marta, knowing what you know about some of these plans, what is most exciting to you about future restoration work in the landscape at the museum?
Oh, in the landscape. Well, I'm very much looking forward to the feeling of a real path between the two houses. Because when you are here now, well, actually, we were talking about this. I'm here with my spouse, and we were talking about when we first came, the area that is going to be the path was a forest, a kind of a jungly, overgrown forest. And now it's grass and trees sort of spread out, but there's going to be a real feeling of connection, of this kind of umbilical cord between the two houses. And I think that that's much more accurate about how the relationship of the houses and their inhabitants, how it was, not just for the family, but also for the people who worked here. And there were many of those as well. So I think that's going to be the next big thing. Beyond that, I always have great hopes for the garden and more roses and all sorts of things, but that we can talk about another day.
Lots to do and lots to see as we do it. So we expect that we'll be having the great pleasure of Marta's company for years to come as we endeavor to restore this landscape. I'm going to bring us to a close, but I wanted to address one last question, which comes from Vivian, and I wanted to just say thank you, Vivian. Vivian wonders, will you continue these wonderful programs when the museum opens again? For those of us who cannot make it to the museum, hint, answer yes. Vivian, yes, we will be running these programs, continue to run virtual programs even when we reopen the museum. It's been such a delight for us to realize just how many new friends were out there waiting for us to reach out. And we were able to do that in the pandemic year, and we will continue doing that. even as the world reopens and even as the museum reopens. And as we mentioned at the start of the program, the museum will remain closed for until next spring as we undertake our most ambitious restoration project yet, which will be bringing more of the spaces at the Homestead, Dickinson's home, online and in their period appearance. So thank you for your patience while we stay closed, and thank you for continuing to engage with us. But most importantly, thank you to Marta McDowell, who has been such an important supporter and a friend of the museum, and whose vast knowledge informs and inspires our work. We hope that you will check out Marta's books and other upcoming events and learn more about her work. You can visit her website to do that, which is www.martamcdowell.com. I'm going to ask Elizabeth to pop that in the chat for you all. And a big thank you to our audience for tuning in today. There are more ways to connect virtually with the museum coming up and soon. Next week, as a special thank you to our museum donors of any amount, we will be holding an evening with biographer Martha Ackman and Apple TV hit show Dickinson creator Elena Smith. And they'll be in conversation right here at the Homestead with our executive director, Jane Wald. So to learn more about our programs or to make a donation, you can visit our website at emilydickinsonmuseum.org. And we thank you again for tuning in. Thank you, Marta. It's been wonderful to be with you, and I'm so glad you could be here in the garden with these wonderful blooms. And we will see you all soon.
Happy summer, everyone.
Happy summer. Take care.